like to begin with a question. We know the title of our lesson today is Trust God when it comes to a matter of respect. We know that the use of profanity as we speak, bad language, dirty words, whatever you want to call it, can be damaging and hurtful to people. But my question is, what is meant by being profane in our attitudes and actions?
Profane.
I don't know that word.
Negative. Is that a rhetorical question?
It is a question
Rhetorical.
which, of course, normally expects an answer, which I don't intend to give. So there you have it.
Repeat that again, please, sir.
What is meant by profane attitudes and actions?
Maybe it's actions that aren't very good, because profanity isn't very good. So maybe it means our actions aren't very good, or
In what
appropriate to God.
way?
Maybe we do things that don't please God on a daily basis. I'm sure I do, but
Actually, you don't have to use profanity. William F. Buckley could put you much lower without profanity.
Yeah, he could.
Profane words at
He
all,
could.
yeah. Well, then what you're talking about is getting back to the title, is a matter of respect. If being profane means disrespectful, then there are certainly lots of ways that you can be disrespectful without using bad language. And really that's what our lesson boils down to today, because we are going to be talking about respect. However, I'm going to start out by reading you a brief passage from the Bible you've all heard before, in which one of the most famous disciples of all, Peter, uses profanity.
really.
While Peter was below in the courtyard, one of the servant girls of the high priest came by. When she saw Peter warming himself, she looked closely at him.
Hi, Rick.
Oh, Rick, you also were with that Nazarene Jesus, she said, but he denied it. I don't know or understand what you're talking about, he said, and he went out into the entryway. When the servant girl saw him there, she again said to those standing around, "This fellow is one of them." Again, he denied it. After a little while, those standing near said to Peter, "Surely you are one of them, for you are a Galilean." And by the way, you could always tell who a Galilean was because of the way they spoke. He had a very different accent, so it was pretty obvious he was a Galilean. He began to call down curses upon himself, and he swore to them, "I don't know this man you're talking about." Immediately the rooster crowed, and Peter remembered the word Jesus had spoken to him. Before the rooster crowed, you will disown me 3 times. He broke down and wept. Well, I think we're awful harsh on Peter when we read this. We ought to back off a little bit and give Peter a break. Most of the time when we read or tell this story, we villainize Peter. He denies Jesus 3 times. But we fail to remember that up to this point, Peter is the one person who had displayed nothing but reckless courage. I mean, he had drawn his sword in the Garden of Gethsemane, apparently ready to take on the accusers all by himself. He even managed to wound the servant of the high priest. Now, prudence would have dictated, wouldn't it, that at this point, Peter had better make himself pretty scarce and disappear. The last place he should ever have gone. The last place. This is reserved for you, so I The last place he should ever have gone was to the courtyard of the high priest's house. But that's where he went. So we say, well, that was pretty foolish. Or was it? Maybe it was just audacious. Maybe it was courageous. The others had fled, but Peter actually was keeping his word. He was going to remain loyal to Jesus. However, we also see here the fact that Peter is a human. He has human weaknesses just like every one of us. The night was apparently cold. He was huddled by a fire with, it's okay, I'll remember.
It's more respectful to look at the teacher.
Talking about respect here.
The night was cold. He was huddled by the fire with his cloak pulled over him, kind of like a hoodie. Nevertheless, somebody recognizes him, and Peter denies all connections with Jesus. But this is really important. Any reasonable man at this point would surely have left the courtyard as quickly as possible, right? We would have. But not Peter. He stays. And it happens a second time. And he still doesn't run, he still stays. And then a third time. He does deny Jesus, but he doesn't run. What Peter does this third time is to swear he does not know Jesus and calls down curses and profanities upon himself if he is not being truthful. But he does not flee from the position that he's in. And of course, then it is that it happens, right? See, the Roman night was divided into 4 watches, starting at 6 in the evening until 6 a.m. in the morning. And at the end of that third watch, which was 3 o'clock in the morning, that's when the Roman guard changed, okay? And at that point, there was a trumpet blast called the Gallicinium. Gallicinium is Latin for cockcrow. So just as Peter speaks his third denial, a trumpet call sounds out across the city. Peter clearly hears it. And he recalls what Jesus had said, and he was devastated. Now it is true, regardless of his demonstrated courage, Peter did fall to temptation through fear. It's easy for us to criticize. It's probably the same thing any normal person would have done. I'd be scared to death. I didn't want to get crucified. I'd run and hide somewhere like all the rest of the disciples did. You know, everybody has a breaking point. And it's here that Peter reaches his breaking point. And we might assume that most men would have reached that point long before that, right? So rather than be shocked at Peter's fall, we might rather consider being amazed at his courage. But what about this issue of profanity? We gotta consider one other amazing thing here. There's only one source from which this story could have come. What is it?
Peter.
Peter himself. It had to be Peter himself telling this story. It's a story he's telling on himself about his denial. He's saying, this is what I did. This is what I did, and you know what? Even after that, Jesus never stopped loving me anyway. So it's kind of a confession story that Peter tells himself.
Right, it's interesting, I just paging through, it's in all 4 Gospels.
Yes,
that
it is.
story. That's one of the few things I can think of that are in all 4
Right,
Gospels.
there's not that many. There are a lot of things that are in 2 or maybe 3, but very few are in all 4, but that one's there. There was an evangelist called Brownlow North. He was a man of God. But in his youth, he had lived a pretty wild life. I'm glad I never did that.
Where are those days?
One Sunday he was to preach in Aberdeen. Before he entered the pulpit, a letter was handed to him. The writer recounted a shameful incident in Brownlow's life before he became a Christian. And in that letter it stated that if he dared to preach, he would rise up in the church and publicly proclaim what he had once done. Brownlow North took the letter into the pulpit with him. He read it to the congregation. He told them that it was absolutely true. And then he told them how through Christ he had been forgiven, how he had been enabled to overcome himself and put the past behind him, and how through Christ he was a new creature. In other words, he used his own shame as a magnet to draw people to Christ. That's what Peter did.
That's called getting ahead of the story.
Pardon?
Getting ahead of the story.
Getting ahead of the story is certainly true. And that's what Peter did too. He told men, I hurt Jesus, I let him down like that, and he still loved me, he still forgave me, and he can do the same for you.
So Sandy, what was in the letter?
Honey, I wouldn't let you know that for anything in the world.
Oh, brother.
I wasn't around then to teach you.
No, whatever I did in those days, I did all on my own. Can't blame it on Sandy. James Moore, our author, says that one day some years ago he was with a group of people when suddenly they began to gossip. They were attacking a friend of his, and they were actually spreading very ugly, vicious rumors about this friend. He says they were crucifying my friend with harsh, cruel words, and I started to say something to defend my friend and to stop the verbal abuse, but he says I didn't know those people very well, so I just kept quiet. And then he says later as I walked to my car, I was kicking myself. I was feeling sad and ashamed that I hadn't seized the opportunity to stand tall and speak out for my friend. He says, why didn't I speak up? Why didn't I say something to turn the conversation? Why didn't I say a good word for my friend and defend him? Then, he says, I heard it. The unmistakable sound of a rooster crowing off in the distance. Oh boy. And he says, let me ask you something. Have you ever had an experience like that? Have you ever failed like that? Have you ever missed your moment or undermined your best self? Have you ever denied your faith? He says, have you ever heard a rooster crow? That's a pretty powerful little story. Well, this was the identical moment of pain when Peter denied Jesus 3 consecutive times. If you'll recall earlier at the Last Supper, when Jesus had said he would be betrayed by one of the 12, and everyone would fall away, Peter's the one that vehemently protests. And he says, not me, never. I will never fall away. Even if all the others do, I will be there. And so Jesus says, Peter, before the cock crow, you're going to deny me not only once, but 3 times.
He denied him, but he was there.
That's correct. That's correct. So, again, we see the strength and courage of Peter, but we also see his human frailty as well. You know. And, you know, some people don't believe that the stuff in the Bible is true, but when you think about it, the Bible is so true, it's painful. Take a look at all the disciples. They're not pictured as saints, really. They're not pictured as perfect persons. They're pictured as very human people that have all the foibles and problems that we do, which is great because it makes me feel better as I try to be a disciple. But there's something here we want to focus on in this lesson for today. The 3rd time Peter denied Jesus, he begins to swear and curse. And it was apparently because of this that the others nearby did not confront him again regarding his association with Jesus. So, what can we make of that? I would guess, wouldn't you think, that profanity and discipleship don't necessarily go together? I mean, there's a lot of defining marks of a Christian disciple, but I don't think profanity is one of them. Perhaps we should consider this. Profanity can be a lot more than verbal expletives. In reality, it's a matter of how we treat holy things, how we treat other people, relationships, sacred relationships. Do we treat those with contempt and disdain or disrespect? Words can certainly be profane, but more than that, our attitudes and our actions can be a lot more profane than our words.
The Jews had a word for that. It was blasphemy.
Yes. Blasphemy against God and holy things.
Yeah. That was interpreted though by humans, so nobody ever really knew what it meant.
Nobody ever really knew what
Right.
it meant or didn't want to know what
Right.
it meant. So, first of all, in what ways do we deny Jesus by being profane? Well, first of all, I'm going to do what our author does in his book. It's okay. She was out rolling around in the snow in Chicago barefoot. Now she's having a heat flash again. In what ways do we deny Jesus? Well, first of all, profane words. And I ask each one of you, do you fit one or more of these categories?
Do we have to answer it out
No,
loud?
no.
Around the
No, but I'm going to tell you ahead of time, I fit more than one of them.
And you're first.
It's kind of interesting for us to examine the reasons why people swear. Well, one reason is because some people just don't know any better. Have you ever been told by someone that swearing is a sign of ignorance?
No, that's not.
And that people who do it all the time need a dictionary as much as they need a Bible? They aren't intelligent enough to know the appropriate words to express themselves, so they swear and cuss.
Does this mean like when you're driving, is that okay?
And confess to
Oh,
the
okay,
group
all
once.
right.
If no one hears it, is it cursing?
Yes, right, in your
Yeah.
car.
Yes, if no one's in the forest when the tree falls, did it really make a thud? Okay. I was told this, and I know exactly who told it to me, and I know exactly where I was when it was told to me. It was Mabel Mitchell.
Mabel Mitchell.
In my English class,
Yes.
when I was a junior in high school. We were talking about vocabulary and words and everything. This is exactly what she said. Swearing is a sign of ignorance. It's because you're not smart enough to know the right words. A second category are people who use profanity because they have basic feelings of insecurity. I mean, let's face it, usually it's simply yes or no or sufficient. But some folks are so insecure that they find it necessary to emphasize or to color what they say with profanities. And they think that that gives them some sort of an appearance of authority. And they've come to the conclusion that other people aren't really going to believe them unless they use some really colorful language. A third category, a lot of the time people swear because they are angry. They're boiling inside and that heat bubbles to the surface in the form of profane language. Yes. Some people think that profane language is a way of gaining acceptance. It's particularly true with young people. It's a way to be just one of the guys. Cussing a blue streak shows people how grown up you are. You're using what we call adult language. It's an attempt to hide your feelings of immaturity. Still others use profanity without thinking because they are simply insensitive to the people around them. They loudly shout out obscenities without concern over who hears them, even children. They're just totally oblivious. Then there are those people who use vulgar or profane language to let off steam. It is common in traffic jams.
Don't look at me.
I'm just waiting for you to blast me again. Long lines at
In
the
store,
DMV,
yeah.
when the power goes off, when something breaks that you're trying to use. These are what we call circumstances of severe provocation. Whatever the case, I'll tell you something. Strong language is sometimes necessary and effective. but it still does not have to be vulgar or offensive or belittling or dehumanizing to other people. However, James Moore tells us, in no situation is it justified to use the name of God or Jesus as a curse.
The what?
To use the name of God or Jesus as a curse. That is wrong,
Oh, yeah,
always, period.
Right.
That's profane.
Mhm.
Yes,
The rest is vulgar. We got a lot of four-letter words that are not profane, they're
Yes.
vulgar.
well, if we could all stop at hell and damn, we'd probably be better off.
Yeah, but
I have
even
no
that's,
problem
even
with
that's
that.
a shortcut.
Sometimes words are used for shock value also.
Oh, yes,
Yeah,
yes, absolutely.
I've done
And,
that.
I think the first time my wife used a bad word in front of my child, there was plenty of shock going on because they thought she was perfect and didn't,
Well, I was just trying to.
My
the
mother-
humbleness.
I never heard my mother as much as
No,
say
she
hell
never
or
even said
damn in
damn.
my life. She was amazing. And believe me, with my father, she had plenty of reason to say stuff on occasion. Not because he was a terrible person, but just because he was very authoritative and very chauvinistic. And, oh well, that's another whole story.
you know, it's interesting, agnostics and atheists, I've heard them use profane language.
Yes,
That's an oxymoron.
yeah, it is. They'll say goddamn, and you say, you don't believe in God, what,
That's,
Yeah.
yeah,
what do you say?
and I think profanity proves God's there.
I guess so.
It proves it.
I never thought of that. The second way that we can be profane is with our attitudes. And as I mentioned earlier, profane is defined in the dictionary as being contemptuous or irreverent. That's what the dictionary says. So it does not have to be just spoken words. There is such a thing as being a very profane person without ever using a dirty word. Got that? Prejudice is profane. Arrogance is profane. Disrespect, jealousy, pettiness, resentment, bitterness, ingratitude, those are all profane. Any attitude that results in people getting hurt or dehumanized is profanity. The Houston Chronicle reported the shocking results of a survey of some 1,700 young people in Providence, Rhode Island. An unbelievable percentage of the young people, this is 6th grade through 9th grade, said in the survey that they thought it was okay for a man to force himself on a woman if he had spent money on her, or if they had been dating for 6 months or more.
That was what grade? Could you repeat?
6th through 9th grade.
What part of the country was this?
Good. This was in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. Excuse me, Providence, Rhode Island.
And what year?
I believe that survey came out of 1988.
My gosh.
That kind of attitude is so profane because it endorses the abuse of another person. To use or abuse another person in any way is wrong. The abusive, arrogant attitude is a total denial of everything Jesus taught and everything Jesus stood for. And then, finally, there's the matter of profane actions. This comes from a story told by James Moore. He says, at the inauguration of Jake Schrum, the 14th president of Southwestern University, the guest speaker was former President of the United States, Jimmy Carter. Mr. Carter is such a fine Christian gentleman, and he brings grace to every occasion. He told this story about something that happened to him in Japan just a short time after he had left the White House. He was giving a speech to a large group of Japanese people at a United Methodist College in Japan. He said the people were excited and nervous. He was excited and nervous too, he said. So he decided to try to relax everybody by starting his speech with a joke. Now, this is a risky thing to do
Yeah, because they don't.
because of language differences.
Right.
And I know that because when I get an all-Japanese crowd or a German crowd on the raft, my usual funny little stuff doesn't go over at all. So, he told a joke, and the translator repeated it. Mr. Carter said that he had used the joke many times before and usually got a nice chuckle out of the audience. But in this case, the audience broke into incredible, uproarious laughter. They were falling on the floor laughing. Mr. Carter was amazed and very happy about their response. So after the speech, he says to the interpreter, that was just such a wonderful response to my joke. How did you translate it to get such a laugh? The Japanese translator smiled and bowed respectfully, but didn't answer. Well, Mr. Carter was determined to know how he made the joke so funny, so he continued to ask the interpreter, how did you translate that? And finally the translator said he knew the audience would never get it. And so he had said to them in Japanese, Mr. Carter has just told a funny story. Everyone must laugh like crazy. Well, the question you might ask is, why would the translator even do that? I mean, why did the audience go along with it with so much enthusiasm? Well, you understand Japanese culture?
Respectful.
Typical Japanese, all a matter of honor and respect. Both the interpreter and the crowd wanted to show honor and respect to the former President of the United States, Jimmy Carter, and they went right along with it without a word. Now, our author of the lesson, James Moore, says he thinks Jesus would really like that story.
Yeah.
But Jesus would want to enlarge upon it. Jesus would like to see us extend that kind of respect to everybody. Not just presidents, not just queens or senators. Jesus calls on us to treat all people with dignity and honor and kindness and appreciation and graciousness. In 1988, National Geographic Society archaeologists discovered the grave of a wealthy warrior priest near the pyramids of the ancient Moche people in Peru. The archaeologists knew immediately that the man in the grave was powerful and highly regarded because of the abundance of gold in the tomb. His clothing was covered with gold decoration. He was surrounded with gold artifacts. He was taking fabulous wealth with him into the next life. He says the Moche had obviously not heard that you can't take it with you. This man was trying to take enough wealth with him that he could live as comfortably in the next life as he had lived in this life. Here's what I want you to hear and think about, James Moore says. There were 6 other people buried in that grave, presumably servants. And a soldier with a sword in his hand was also buried above the others. He was a guard sent along to protect them on their journey into the afterlife. And his feet had been cut off. So done so that he couldn't flee his post.
Was he buried alive, do you think?
It doesn't say, but it's entirely possible.
It's gory.
7 innocent people, 7 probably very healthy young people,
Okay, then they
were killed so that they could accompany the priest and care for him in the afterlife. Now, you know, that's kind of a disturbing thing, don't you think?
Disturbing story.
All that treasure and 7 dead people for what? The implication is very obvious. It was apparently thought that the life of the priest was important but the lives of the other 7 people were not. He was of value. The others were worthless. In Washington, D.C., I'm sure a lot of you have been there, there is a monument to the Vietnamese veterans. How many of you have been there?
What?
It is a profound, profound experience if
Yeah.
you've ever been there. Here you are in the middle of a major city with all the hustle and bustle going on, and you go down into this little miniature valley where the monument is, and with all the people running around and everything, it immediately becomes silent.
Yep.
No matter how many people are there, it is dead quiet. It's really remarkable. And it's a remarkable monument for a number of reasons, but the more significant one, which is immediately apparent, is this. Anybody who visits it, every name there is there. 58,000 names. They are not listed according to rank, with the officers first, for example, nor are the officers' names in larger print or letters than the enlisted persons. The artist wouldn't agree to that. She said that that would be too bureaucratic, too dehumanizing. She insisted that the names be listed according to the date on which they fell, as if to say, this day will always be remembered because this person on this day died. 58,000 names. Every single person killed in Vietnam is there. When the memorial was dedicated, every name on the wall was read aloud. It took 2.5 days to do it, but every single name was read. On that wall in Washington, D.C., every name is equal to every other name. Because every sacrifice was considered equal to every other sacrifice, and every life as precious as every other life. So James Moore asks a question. He said, how did mankind ever travel from Peru to Washington, D.C.? He says, well, amazingly, it was through another grave, but an empty tomb. It was through the one person who conquered death and showed us how to reach out to every person with love and respect and compassion. And he taught us that it's not enough to love those who look and think and dress like us. To fail to respect every person is to deny Jesus.
Right, interesting that memorial, most of the monuments to wars to have the name war in them. This is the Veterans Memorial.
Oh,
And
yeah.
it doesn't use the word war,
Yes,
it's
that's
honoring the
unbelievable, too.
people, not the war.
All of the monuments in Washington are impressive.
Yeah.
But I never have experienced anything like
Yeah.
I felt when I went to the Vietnam Memorial. And, one of my cousins died in Vietnam. He was a helicopter pilot. And I found David Fox right there on the wall. It was a very moving experience. There was an actor who played the part of Benjamin Franklin for school kids. He would dress up and tell his story in the first person to give the students a personal introduction to Benjamin Franklin and give them some idea of his place in history. And then when he was through, he would answer questions. Well, one day, a little boy, you can just picture this, little boy raises his hand and said, I thought you died. Well, the actor said, well, I did die. I died on April 17, 1790, when I was 84 years old. But I didn't like it. And I am never, ever going to do that again. Well, that sounds pretty arrogant. And it was
Yeah.
pretty arrogant. But the actor was very pleased with his answer, very proud of himself. But just then, another hand went up in the back row, and Another little boy asked, when you were in heaven, did you see my mother?
Oh.
Ooh.
The actor was stunned. He didn't know how to answer. He didn't know what to say. And he could tell by the boy's tone that he had just lost his mother, and the question was very, very important to him. The actor knew he had to say something. And inside he prayed, God help me, please help me.
Help me out of this lie.
And then he heard himself say, I sure did. And she was the prettiest angel in heaven. Well, that's what you call moving from profane arrogance to compassion because of the grace of God. God did it for Peter, and it is precisely what Christ wants us to do. Move from arrogance to compassion. Move from selfish pride to graciousness. Move from selective love to unconditional love and respect for all people. That is the opposite of being profane.
That was a great lesson.
That was.
Next week, trust God when you feel lonely.